been much more dialogue than kind of informal discussion and presentation. So I'm, as a practitioner, 3 years ago, I was asked as an expert to contribute to a kind of reflection to rethink the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs, which is the one kind of entitled to deal with all the social development in Lebanon. So we're a pool of experts, and it was commissioned by, at that time, in 2016, if I recall well, by the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP. And to make it very brief, so the main result that came out of it, I'll start with that, following all the investigation, the research, and things that we all did, that the Ministry of Social Affairs, okay, had to kind of transform itself towards something called much more Ministry of Social Development, okay? So the idea behind it, that it was very clustered in the way it was working, so much of its competences were spread out through different ministries, okay? We're trying to bring them again within certain cohesion and logic. And I could summarize it by saying that the Ministry of Social Affairs needed to shift from the logic of being service provision, okay, towards one that really reflects on strategies related to social development and kind of being the authority that could champion enabling the needed environment to move towards this social development. Now, I was particularly asked, and this is what I'll be sharing with you now, to reflect a little bit on strengthening and maybe rethinking also the link between planning, okay, and social development, and rethinking therefore the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs through this lens. Now, before going further into that, I would like to say that this was subject of a note. I can make this note available to Sebastian for those of you who are really interested, since we have only a few minutes. Okay. But let me first try to very quickly summarize the situation in Lebanon. Okay, so maybe some of you are not really familiar with what's happening. Okay, so first of all, Lebanon history, since it gained its independence, so from the French in 1943, has been mainly marked by alternating periods of political stability and turmoil, interspersed with prosperity, and this prosperity was mainly built on Beirut's position as a regional center at that time for finance and trade. Now, you all heard about the 75-90 major drastic episode of war, okay? So that had heavily damaged Lebanon's economic and physical and social infrastructure. It did cut national output, national economy by half, and ended Lebanon's leading regional position in several economic sectors. So we had other cities surrounding, some in the Gulf and in other regional area, that kind of took bits and parts of the economical role that Beirut had before 75. Now, another two indicators quite interesting, which is that the migrants number, the Lebanese migrants number, represent the double, more than the double of its inhabitants. So its inhabitants are estimated by 4 million. Just in Brazil, they say, we don't have exact figures, that potentially in Sao Paulo, you would have 6 million kind of descendants of Lebanese and maybe also Syrian origin. So this is first indicator, quite interesting. And the second one is that immigrants represent almost half of its current population, okay? And maybe we're talking about Palestinians and Syrians immigrants, okay? So these two indicators are quite interesting. Now, normally when one thinks that the war has ended in 1990, one would have expected that a certain dynamic would have been put in place. But actually, other indicators show that the growth and the development of cities and villages in Lebanon over the past decades so has largely manifested in a way that goes towards more segregation, actually, and that maybe will pave the way for Robert's intervention. And so less mix of social groups, okay, and fragmentation is increasing. For example, just to give you also some other figures to frame things. So in the case of Beirut, which is the capital city, so we are witnessing increased segregation of social and sectarian groups. So we have 24 informal settlements in Beirut, okay, which is huge. I mean, Beirut is not that large. And within those informal settlements, we have something close to 20% of the population that lives within those informal settlements, okay? So it doesn't reach the number and figures that we have in Cairo and in Istanbul, but still it's quite significant. At the same time, also some other indicators. So we have the poverty level in Lebanon. Recently, it has reached new heights. So we're talking about moderate and extreme poverty segments in some region, especially the north area. I don't know if you're familiar with the Akkar and northern area of Beirut. So kind of exceeding the figure that I have, 20% of the total population, okay, which is also quite significant. We're talking about the poverty. So what's been happening is the Lebanese state is, or was at least in the beginning of the last decade, trying to rethink its governance system to try to alleviate this poverty. Okay. Now in 2011, we unfortunately for Lebanon, because definitely unfortunately for Syria, but also unfortunately for Lebanon, because it happened at a time where we were trying to rebuild our institution. So the influx of Syrian refugees, so it did place a considerable amount of pressure on the already vulnerable communities in several Lebanon's regions and areas. So it happened that the most vulnerable areas were the one who welcomed the larger number of Syrian refugees. So you can imagine the impact on the infrastructure and services and so on. And in parallel, we're witnessing a harsh competition between Syrians and Lebanon and Lebanese on low and medium qualified local manpower. So there's a competition in terms of economy. So definitely, it was a moment when several agencies, international donors, UN agencies, and so on, did step in. They were realizing that the Lebanese government won't be able on its own to solve the whole situation. So they came in, they stepped in with several programs. Some, to make it short, were at some level coordinated with central authorities, and some were led by Dutch actually agencies, also just to give a sample, were immediately injected and activated with some local stakeholders at the local level, shall it be municipalities, other civil society organizations, and so on. Okay. Now, let's go back to the Ministry of Social Affairs. So the Ministry of Social Affairs, again, to make it short, has one very interesting tool, and it's called Social Development Centers. So in Lebanon, we have maybe more than 50 social development centers scattered all along the Lebanese territory. This has always been the case, okay? And it's a structure that, to summarize it also, its main area of intervention is to encourage community involvement and participation in the planning processes, and to provide social services to all. I'm just reading its mission statement, okay? So to provide social services to all, and particularly to individuals with special needs, okay? So these social services are spread. We don't have really a logic on how they are being spread and in relation with the number of inhabitants, okay? But you can find them along the national territory. And also, in their case, their role is mainly restricted to service provision, okay? And they're incapable, or they were, and they're still incapable, of shifting towards kind of more regional and social development. So we did work on our report on how to rethink the role. We thought that that was an interesting entry point to rethink the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs that where they are located. Now, on local level, we have a national physical master plan that covers the national territory. It was approved by a ministerial decree in 2009, but when one reads it, you feel that it's not really directly tackling social issues, so social development issues, okay? It's much more physical planning and land use planning and not really addressing questions related to social planning, to social development. When, during the past decades, when the Syrian crisis refugee happened, I was saying that some international organizations stepped in and they tried to bring some programs. One of them was through the UN Habitat, it's worth mentioning. So they tried to establish regional, they call them the RTO, and it's regional technical officers. So the need was to try to compensate, okay, the social development at the scale of regions, municipalities, and union of municipalities, because this is absent in Lebanon. So to bring the urban development at much more local level, okay? And so it's an international organization, UN Habitat, who tried to step in. And to the last information I have is that those RTOs now are not really functional and operational, okay? So they did intervene at some point, and then they kind of stopped their work. Now another program, it was brought in by several countries, EU mainly, and it was called Art Gold Lebanon. Also, there they said that maybe the solution would be to try to encourage all those regions to develop what they called local economic development plan, and they established agencies, they call them the LEDA, so local economic development agencies, also spread in all those areas. So this is to show you that all those institutions, instead of reinforcing the Ministry of Social Affairs and the existing structure, kind of came in and tried to duplicate them with other agencies, okay? I can let you just imagine the lack of coordination and the overlapping, especially that we're in a case where we need to act in urgency and the financial means are really reduced and so on. So we were facing this situation. Now to try to also depict the situation, because it's completely different from the one here, so we need to understand that, for example, public transport is almost absent in Lebanon, and this is an issue that we need to address. The provision of affordable housing is also very much limited. So we had two institutions that kind of were facilitating this, but lately, in view of the economic crisis, Lebanon is going through a very harsh economic crisis. The role of those two institutions kind of was stopped, and in any case, they were not really answering the demand of this provision of affordable housing. Now, there's major issues in most of the areas in Lebanon in relation to the provision of public spaces, okay? So we have this, we lack into this. Definitely environmentally friendly urban areas, so areas that could be accessible to all, and inclusive. And we're facing also the protection of not only agricultural land, but all agricultural activities that go around this agricultural land. So we're still facing a major migration from rural areas toward the center, and not really being incapable of securing a sustainable development for those rural areas. Now, we came up with several recommendations to try to link, first of all, to restitute the work and the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs, and to enhance the linkages between this institutions, so the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Directorate of the Urban Planning that is located within the Ministry of Public Work and Roads. I will not go much into this because I think we need to respect time, but I can share with you that at some point we did try to assess the need to have another distribution of social services on a local level, and in order to avoid duplicating other services and other infrastructure and so on, within the study we did reconsider the role of public schools. Okay, so we have in Lebanon public school and private schools. It happened that public schools are kind of scattered and well distributed on the national territory. So within this group, we tried to reassert the role of public schools and to open them towards maybe potentially playing the role of social centers, okay, to try to alleviate and to answer to some of the issues and questions that were being raised. The other point the other major point that we're facing is that one would not imagine that, but for example, in Lebanon, we lack of data. So how can we deal with social development-related issues when we don't have even informations and data? So also in our recommendation, we're trying to rethink the way how we can have data being produced on a regular basis. Some of the data that is available exists, I mean, to 2010, 2012, so it's not being refreshed, okay? And when it does exist, it's not accessible. So this is also a major issue that we tried to assess in order to reinforce the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs, okay? So I ran very quickly, okay? But I'm open to your questions and so on. And this note, I can make it available through Sebastian's for those of you who would like to read it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. So just before we have some questions and responses, maybe, if I followed you and understood you correctly, what you're trying to see is you're looking at kind of all aspects of life, of life in a society, among them housing, education, public schools you were talking about, public transport, and then the planning. How does planning relate to all these things?
Yeah. And public spaces also.
Yeah, public space, and so it's like a very comprehensive perspective on society, and then doing an analysis of what is going on right now, what is the problem, and how could it be improved, and what could the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs be? So it's actually like making the Ministry of Social Affairs a bit more important to all these ideas. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thanks. And then that's of course like it's a huge challenge because it's like all the basic aspects of living in a society. What is going on? How could we improve them?
Yeah. I need to maybe to add that would be the last sentence, and that ultimately it is also a political issue. Of course. And so during this study that we were doing, it was clear for us that we were not inventing the wheel, that most of those solutions are clearly known and could be learned from other countries and or could be identified through our case studies. But we were facing definitely the lack of a political will. Now we tried to explain this. If we put aside maybe the specificities that are embedded within our culture and so on, so maybe also Robert who might be talking about that. So in Lebanon you have the religious foundations that and the social network done through the families and so on that kind of tend or try so far to compensate the lack of the weakness of the state. Okay, so this is really in our culture. This is how things do proceed. But at the same time, I think also that the state really is not engaging in shifting its practices, because it's maybe a way. So in your country, the state is strong because it does provide services. In our country, and sometimes maybe furthermore in our region, the state is strong because it doesn't provide services. It enforces its role, because through, again, clientelism and parallel services that some politicians are capable of providing, because the state is weak. Okay, so maybe it takes time to be explained, but it's completely a different approach and different mentality, and we cannot definitely completely reverse that. We need to acknowledge this is a reality that has been undergoing even before the establishment of the modern state of Lebanon. So how can we, within those shallow shape of institutions that we have, nevertheless try to find a solution? Okay, so we'll never be in the ideal case scenario, but nevertheless, how can we act? How can we advance? How can we move forward? This is really the challenge that we're confronted with.
And sorry that I'm asking the first question. It's not very, but maybe it's like a question that can preface other questions. Like, why would it be important to make the Ministry of Social Affairs more important?
This is very interesting question. So. And again, it's the role of international organizations. So you will find international organization being in contact with the Council of Ministers and telling them, the only way ahead is to proceed by doing that. And we come with a budget. It's like so many things happen in Lebanon. So we have international institution. In that case, it's called the UNDP, who came with the budget. He said, fine, I can fund a study. So try to reflect logically. It should be the Ministry of Social Affairs. So let's try to reflect on a way to reinforce and reconsider the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs. And that was launched actually in 2010-11, but then the studies, time to get it implemented and so on, it took some time. And when the Syrian crisis refugee came, again, they readdressed the Ministry of Social Affairs, and they asked the Ministry of Social Affairs, all these donors and agencies, to be the authority coordinating, to try to be the authority coordinating between all these agencies. So from the consultant point of view, I was requested to contribute to a study in the Beirut, which is the recipient of of major number of the refugees. And we were holding there weekly meetings with all those agencies coming, and it was the representative of the Ministry of Social Affairs who was trying to lead the meeting and to organize and to provide all this coordination, but definitely with very much limited means, and the effect and the result, I can let you imagine that it was not really so sufficient on the ground. So it's in part internally and in part externally, people coming and say, yes, we should, Ministry of Social Affairs should be the one, and then let's try to reconsider the role of these social development centers. Okay? But our approach as expert was to say, maybe not really the social development centers, because it represents even a load on the state to run them, to operate them, and so on. And let's try to reconsider other means. So maybe to reinforce other institutions. Some of them are in relation with civil society, okay? Some other type of networks that already do exist. So should we maybe consider them instead of the only institutional ones, okay, since they already failed? So is it only changing their role that will change the situation, or maybe thinking differently? So we're faced with that type of thought. Should we reconsider things in a completely different way than really going and basing our effort only through and channeling it only through the institutional yes.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Because you said that the most of the refugees, they come into the more rural areas, right? So
yes, they're already the most vulnerable ones.
Yeah.
The one that it happened have the highest level of scarcity in terms of service provision. So we have a high stress on water, on infrastructure, on wastewater, on waste management. Yeah.
So people who have the least, they give the most in this situation, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting question. Yeah, most of those vulnerable areas are located in the north and in the Bekaa, so it's the plain, agricultural plain areas, and majority of Syrians, because they come from agricultural area, and they used to, before the Syrian crisis refugee, we already had a large number of Syrians who came and already worked within those agricultural areas. So their network was easier for them there, and this is the area where they kind of came in, thinking that they would easily find work, and they had already some relation with some families and some stakeholders present there.
So the only thing I can think about now is I forgot the name of the guy that developed this, but there's the triangle, right, with basic needs, and then Maslow, that was it, the triangle of Maslow. So I can only think about the fact that this is an area where people don't have enough to give away.
Yeah.
So they are basically still providing their basic needs, but they're also trying to provide for the basic needs of the people that come in, right?
Yeah.
And as far as for our educational part of that triangle, we were always taught that that is not possible. The only way that you can provide others with the basic needs is when you are beyond that point.
Yeah.
So if we have a very poor area, basically, where there is a need for water, for public transportation, for everything like that, is there even a possibility for a solution? I don't see how a rural area where there's still so much to gain for the people that were there originally, I don't know how they can provide enough to give basic needs to people that come in as new people.
Yeah, that's clear.
So I feel like those areas are just getting poorer by trying to help others. And you also said that there are was it educational programs that are available, but when they are available you can't get to them?
Yeah.
Was it educational programs?
Educational program? No.
No, it was in the end of your presentation.
Well, I was talking about data.
Oh, data.
So data is not.
Why is it impossible to get to it if it's there?
Again, data is a question is related to power.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of institutions in Lebanon try to conceal, to keep the data concealed with them, because they are the one who will be having this power. But again, it's also a question. It's in when the French came, the first data, so in 1920, with the first census, was to try to identify the population in relation with their religion, and so they did the census once, and we were incapable since then to do it again, to repeat it, because it might change completely the equilibrium of politics in Lebanon, because the number of the demography in relation with religion changed and shifted completely. Okay, so yes, we do have institutions. Their role is to collect data, but they don't do it frequently. They don't do it necessarily on an annual basis, and they don't communicate it. And we, as planners, as in that case, as an expert, and even sometimes at the university, we end up building our data ourselves, okay, because we're not able to access data. And this is, a major impediment, because when you need to work to consider social development, having access to some good information basis is the first step that you need. But then I would like to answer your first question, because it shows, a lot of municipalities actually considered the influx of Syrian refugees as an opportunity for development. And again, the Lebanese system is very much contradictory, so we need to not consider it from like you would consider it here. So those poor, maybe sometimes localities, okay, because when the Syrian refugees came, so again you have all those international agencies that started knocking on the door of the localities and municipalities and union of municipalities and said, give us your project, okay? Now it's a moment where we can fund, okay? So some of the project that they had already and they couldn't fund initially, or they were trying but they didn't succeed so far, and not necessarily in direct relation with the Syrian influx, okay, of refugee, they started putting them on the table and debating and discussing. So they thought that it was the good moment. But then let me also tell you that the Benin state has gone through different phases in relation with this to the question. So during the first 2 years, they kind of turned their eye and they said, we don't want to deal with the issue of Syrian refugees. So on the opposite of how it was dealt with in Turkey and in Jordan, where they were put in camps. I'm not saying that this is the solution at all, but I'm just saying how other countries dealt with. So in the case of Lebanon, they let it happen, okay? And they said, fine, within a few months, maybe one year, the whole problem will be done, and we don't even need to deal with it, okay? But because the situation kind of now, it's been, I don't know what, 2011, it's been 8 years, okay? So meanwhile, the government is trying to change the way it's dealing with the situation, okay? But facing some internal difficulties because most of the politicians do not agree on the way they want to deal with this situation. So it's taking time and they're not yet finding the real convenient way to deal with it, okay? Meanwhile, localities are trying to compensate by trying to put those projects on the table and say, let's get some money on the back of the Syrians, actually.